So just a show of hands, I mean, obviously you're here, so you have some sense for what the ArcGIS Data Interoperability Extension is. Who's used it, or touched it, or played with it, read about it? Okay, so this is very new to everybody, and that's okay, because that's my intention, is to really start from the beginning and introduce. I don't work for Esri, I don't work for Safe Software. I'll say right up front that, you know, I've been very impressed with this as a tool. I'm not here to sell software, clearly. I work for the state government. I don't know it all. I'm sure I'm going to use incorrect terminologies that the folks at Esri would probably cringe at, because I'm still learning. So that's my basic disclaimer about, you know, where we are. I'm going to show some things. Some of you might look at that and say, oh, I could just write a Python script to do that. You probably could. I probably can't. So the value of the tool I'm going to talk about is really it's a way to visually manipulate data. That's kind of my short spiel on what you can do with this tool. I'm going to mention this right up front. If you have questions, please ask those as we go along. I'm not going to save 5 minutes to the end. I'm just going to keep going unless there's questions along the way. I've designed, I hope, the presentation where I can just basically cut it off whenever Eric, there he is, says, you're done, sit down, and I will be done and sit down, because I probably got way more slides that I can actually cover today. Sound all right? Cool. All right. So let's jump into this. So obviously, where do we want to start with? Well, this is the official Esri definition. You can read that for yourself. But what I'll draw your attention to is this notion of spatial ETL, extract, transform, and load. So if you're not familiar with that terminology, what it means to me is taking in sources of data, potentially multiple sources from multiple formats, multiple locations, streaming in services, manipulating that data in some fashion, which we'll talk about, and creating outputs or output. That's what ETL in my mind is all about. Something that's maybe not stated, but I think is implicit, is the notion of repeatability. Okay, not just going to do this once, but I'm going to be doing this over and over and over again, you know, to support some kind of a business process. So manipulating data, creating new data, and repeatability. That's really the take-home message as I would describe it. So an obvious question is, well, how the heck am I using it? So if you've been to any of my presentations, WLA presentations the last couple of years, along with my colleague, Jamie Martindale, we talk a lot about historic aerial imagery. That's a different presentation for a different day. But a lot of what we are doing is essentially bringing in lots of historic area imagery, and we have a spatial database which we're using to track that. So it's just simple points representing an individual air photo. So we have a data model that's, I don't know, 24 or 30 fields or so, to, you know, metadata information about each one of those photos. So it's a standardized schema. Well, we get index points that come in from a wide range of sources that have different fields, different information that's available to us, and we need to get that all into one common data model. So what I've been using the interop tool for is really taking a whole bunch of disparate indexes, bringing it into a common data model. And that could be crazy things like all we have is like literally a spatial point, maybe a date that is, and that's it. And we've got to basically figure out a way to construct the data to put into our, what we call the primary index. And that's, you know, the essence of what I've been doing with this tool, but you can do a lot more, bottom line. Again, I don't want to sound like an Esri salesperson here, but you really can do quite a bit. It's been impressive. So I didn't want to save this slide till the very end. You know, I hate when you go to a presentation and you give all these great things, and at the very end it's like, oh, this costs $10,000. Nope. So in this case, list price is a little over $1,700. That's straight from the Esri website. If you're in state government, county government, city government, I believe the pricing structure is the same for everybody. This is a public document that's out there. I'm not like disclosing, you know, state secrets. The price that I found was $550 for government agencies. I am definitely not an Esri licensing expert by any means. You know, when you get into perpetual licenses, ELAs, and all that kind of business, I don't know. But the message here is the pricing on an annual basis. I'm not saying it's like, yeah, we can just try it out and throw it away if we don't need it. You know, it's money, but it's not thousands of dollars, put it that way. So it feels like it's reasonably accessible. Okay, so you may have noticed a few slides back on that Esri definition of what the tool is. So the tool is actually developed by a company called Safe Software. Safe Software has been around since the early 90s. So this is a partnership between Esri and Safe Software. Exactly how it all works out, you know, I don't really know exactly how they fit together, but basically Esri is essentially licensing Safe Software tools for us in turn, GIS users, to take advantage of. Now, I have to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole because I want to explain a couple things as it pertains to training, because this is important because it really threw me off. Whenever you talk about the ArcGIS Data Interoperability Extension, that's Esri software, you'll see references in some of my screen captures, you'll see references to Workbench. Hold that thought. So if you were to go to the Safe Software website, you're not going to see anything that references Workbench. Okay, this was really confusing to me. So if you go to the Safe Software site, you'll see things like FME Form, formerly Desktop, AKA Workbench. So it's like, what software am I actually using here? So the bottom line is FME Form in the Safe Software lingo is what we're talking about, okay? They have other products, you know, confusingly named FME Flow, not Form, Flow. Hey, I don't work for marketing and Safe Software. This is important because training. If you're looking to get into this, sorry, friends at Esri, don't go to the Esri site. They've got really limited training options. Go to the academy.safe.com. That's what I did. I started out, fired up the tool. I'll figure this out. This can't be that hard, is it? It was. So I went through a bunch of classes, you know, free online classes, free training modules, just, you know, click the PowerPoint kind of stuff, training data and so forth. So if you're looking to get into this, specifically look for the training on FME Form. You'll find things like this: integrate data with FME platform, FME Form basic. I think I did most of those 15 courses. I maybe touched a couple of the advanced. I would highly recommend going here, not to the Esri site. The Esri site only had like 3 modules that I could find. You know, maybe logically so because, well, it is a safe software product. Okay, that's the basic introduction. Let's talk about some of the real guts of this stuff. So, you know, one of my very first questions was, it is a separate installation. Well, how the heck do you start this thing up? You know, when I first started it up, quite honestly, I'm like looking over here. It's kind of like Model Builder, sort of like, okay, where is it? I didn't actually realize, oh, it's way over here, to actually fire up the Workbench tool. And again, here you see reference to Workbench, not Form. That's one way to fire up the tool. I'm mentioning this because it was not obvious to me when I first started doing this, for whatever that's worth, could be me. What I do on a daily basis is just an item in a program group. As crazy as that sounds, I think it's worth mentioning because, you know, it is an extension, but it's actually a separate product that you need to fire up. There's a third way to do it. I don't do it this way, but I think it's important to mention because I think it's actually very powerful, potentially, depending on your use cases. So I use ArcGIS Pro exclusively these days. So if you go into toolboxes, project toolbox, new spatial ETL tool, you can create a new what's called spatial ETL tool, which is ArcGIS Data Interoperability. Probably hard for you guys to read, but it's basically saying, all right, you're going to create this new tool. And the thing that's interesting is you can bring in an existing what's called workspace. A workspace would be akin to a model in Model Builder, if that helps kind of bridge the gap there a little bit. And I think why that's important, again, I haven't done a lot of this myself because it doesn't meet my use case, is think about this way. Think about, let's say you've got a business process where you've got a lot of complicated steps, you're bringing in a bunch of data sets, but maybe there's only 1 or 2 inputs where a user has to change a couple things, right? And that could be a black box. So literally, the yellow box up there, spatial ETL tool, maybe to your average user is just simply a black box. They don't really need to know what's happening in there, but you know there's a really complicated workspace that's happening in there. So right in ArcGIS, a person could be using the FME tools and not really necessarily realize it. So I think that's an important concept, which I didn't grasp initially. Again, I don't do it this way because it doesn't, not what I need to do, but I want you to walk away with that because I think that's important. Let me pause. Any questions so far? Also gives me a chance to get a drink. Oh, is that clear? Awesome. Fair enough. Okay, so let's actually look at, oh, and by the way, as you've already gathered, I'm not doing this live because I'm not crazy. No live demos, so I'm just going to do screen captures and a couple little videos here and there. So a lot going on when you first fire up the Workbench tool, or whatever name you want to use for this thing, but the thing to focus on are 3 things: readers, writers, transformers, and they do pretty much what you might expect. Okay, so I'm going to focus first on a reader. So when you click on to start a new reader, it basically asks you, all right, what's the format of the thing you're trying to read, and what's the data set itself? Where is it located? You notice there's an option that says guess from data set. I never do that. I never let it guess because it's maybe going to be wrong, so I usually define that. But something that's kind of fun and interesting, I'm just going to do a little video thing here. I don't know how many input formats there are. It's, I believe, several hundred. And I think I saw scroll by Esri E00 files. Who's old remembers interchange files from back in the day? You know, remember those? Eric's nodding. Old school stuff. But there are hundreds of data formats that you can bring in, suffice it to say. So in this case, this example, I'm going to be looking at something, trying to get something out of a geodatabase. And you get, once you select your geodatabase, it says, all right, what's your where clause? What's your tables? Well, we know if you're a geodatabase user, you know that these are feature classes, but yeah, okay, they're tables, right? Hopefully you're aware of that fact. So some of the terminology maybe doesn't necessarily jive. But then you could take a look and say, all right, well, here's the different feature classes that happen to exist in this geodatabase. I'm sure there's scenarios where you would want to have multiple feature classes selected. I don't know, just the way my brain works, I pretty much have one reader, one feature class. One reader, one feature class. That's just me, how I do things. But there's probably legit reasons for why you would do it otherwise. So then you get something that looks like that. And then it just says, all right, here's your reader. Here's the stuff that I'm going to read to start doing some processing on. Same kind of idea with writers, which I'll get to in a moment here. But first, you can do basic things like, okay, do a simple table preview, spatial preview. You can do basic querying, filtering, things like that, just like in ArcGIS desktop tools. Speaking of writers, so here's an example. And this is just going to be a simple, silly, kind of contrived example. Microsoft Excel file, so I want to take basically a feature class, and I'm just going to spit it out straight through to a Microsoft Excel file. All right, so I've selected a writer, Excel type, drops it in, something like that. Now, something I want to point out, we'll see where my laser pointer went. You notice this little red, I believe they're called ports. Over here, you've got a port that's gray. So the tool, the desktop tool, is really handy in that it'll tell you like, hey, something's not right here. And usually it's highlighted in red in some fashion. So this basically means, hey, you're not really sending me any data. You might want to check this out. That's kind of the way I would describe it. But we'll get to that in just a second. So watch for red. Red is both good and bad, put it that way. So if we look at this, and we're going to bring in a transformer, like so, or excuse me, sorry. We're going to connect the two. Got ahead of myself here. So this is a very simple example, and now what we're doing is actually running this process where behind the scenes it's essentially saying, all right, take all the data from the geodatabase, slap it over into an Excel table, you can preview it, and guess what? It looks exactly the same as the input. Well, because we didn't do anything with it, so you would expect this. Just to prove, in case you don't believe me, yep, sure enough, we've got an Excel spreadsheet that looks like that. I know this is kind of a silly example, but it's the simplest example of going from one format to another. When I first heard about this tool many, many years ago, before I really understood what FME Desktop did, I thought it was kind of a glorified data conversion tool, like, oh, you got a shapefile, you want to make it something else. That's wrong. It can actually do, in fact, that's a small part of what it can do. Here again, I'm sounding like an Esri salesperson. I'm really not. All right, so now let's talk about the transformers. So I'm just going to do it this way. So what we can do is we can click on one of the transformers. There are literally hundreds of transformers, but the one that I use every day when I'm doing this kind of work is called the Attribute Manager. And you'll see how this works in just a moment, but you can basically drag it up to the line. It interrupts the line, and it's basically saying, all right, I think of it like a filter. I'm going to pull this data through this filter, and some stuff's going to happen. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is, hard for you guys to read, but this 95, you can actually cache features, so it doesn't mean it has to read. In this case, it's only 95 features every single time. So it stores those in a cache, and it's nice if you're processing 50,000 records. You can kind of watch and see. You're doing one thing on one computer, and the computer over there, it's like you can see the numbers. This is really nerdy, isn't it? Like, okay, I'm watching my data process, really exciting stuff. But it is actually pretty useful, in all honesty. So that's a very simple example of a transformer. So, with regard to transformers, and this is really where we get into the guts of how things actually work. So if we were to click on the gear icon, looking at the attribute manager, here's some simple examples of what you see. It's basically, okay, what are the input attributes coming into the attribute manager, and what's going out from the attribute manager, at the most basic level, okay? Where things get fun and interesting is when you start to manipulate that. So if we look at this, and let's say we want to get rid of a number of fields, like we don't need object ID, we don't need GeoID, shape length, shape area, not so important what we're trying to do, especially in this silly little example, right? So we're just going to get rid of those. And unsurprisingly, you get something that looks like that, okay? I didn't run it in this particular example, I just want to demonstrate the concept. Okay, so we should dig into this just a little bit more. So if we look at this, and let's say the scenario is we want to add a field. Obviously a very common thing. So if we're going to add a field, we're going to call it state. And for this example, we're just going to say set all the records equal to a state of Wisconsin. We're just going to blanket every single one with Wisconsin. And it's kind of handy that you can move things around. I don't know if you're like me, but I always get frustrated. I want the attributes to be in a certain order because I'm a little bit OCD, so I want to move things around. Super easy to do that kind of an operation here, so that's nice. Digging just a little bit deeper though, we can do things like additional, processing. So there's this thing, you click on the drop down, open the text editor, that's akin to the, what's it called, the code block editor in ArcGIS, by way of example. So this is that text block, so if I do this, you can get a sense for the idea of how it works, basic string processing functions, whole bunch of math functions, way more than I would probably ever know what to do with, and I kind of gloss over there's a bunch of date processing functions as well. So let's say I want to concatenate two fields together. Very simple example. Double click one attribute, type in comma, double click the other attribute, state, good. And there it is, pretty basic. What about if I want to do a search and replace on a text string within a field? So by way of example, so if we were to look at the replace string, we select the field, the string we're going to operate on, county name, and what I wanted to do is replace ST period with Saint. A silly example, but it illustrates the notion here. You do that. And what about if you want to change, as long as you're doing this, what if you want to change the output attribute name from county NAM to county? Watch what happens here. Notice how everything turns red. It means, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing here? That field doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because you just changed it, right? So here again, you see red, good/bad, pay attention to what's going on, okay, behind the scenes. You can also change it in a couple different places. I think you get the basic idea. Okay? And then, just to prove that I'm not completely making this stuff up, so we can see up here, so yeah, we've got our St. Croix, St. Louis. Yeah, I know there's no St. Louis County, Wisconsin. You get the idea, so don't call me on that, okay? But very simple, concatenating two fields together. And no doubt there is a transformer where you could do a string concatenation. I just chose to do it with this method, kind of using code. Well, like you, I look at this and think, well, what is this? That doesn't look like anything I've done before, personally. Whoa, sorry. It's definitely not Python. That would be the Python syntax to do something similar, the same in ArcGIS. It's not Arcade. I almost said Avenue. I'd be really dating myself. It's not Arcade. Yeah, guess what? You get to learn something new. So it's written as TCL programming language. I guess all the cool kids say Tickle, the Tickle programming language. So it's not that bad. I mean, it's like anything else. You just kind of, you Google it, right? You figure out what you got to know. But if you want to do things from a code perspective, yeah, it is yet another thing to learn. Oh, something I glossed over, actually. This is important. Back when I was adding a field, when I first started doing this, the way my brain works is, okay, I'm adding a field. How do I define what data type that is? Like, oh, it's a date, or it's an integer, or it's a string. You might remember I didn't do that. I didn't have to do that. And that drove me crazy because I figured, how can I not define the data type? Well, in fact, you don't have to. You don't have to. In fact, you don't till the very last step when you're creating a writer. So in a very simple example, I don't even know what this was. This looks like an attribute manager up over here. We've got just an empty feature class. All right, so by default, depending on how you've got it configured, it's just going to take whatever the attribute manager is spitting out, drop that straight into the feature class that you're creating, right? And that's because typically it automatically assigns the attribute types. And if it's hard to read for you folks, almost everything in this example says character 200, character 2, even though I know I've got a bunch of stuff that's dates and integers and so forth. Well, so what I typically do for my workflow, I just leave it alone. Don't mess with it until the very end when I go in manually set my attribute definitions. If you're going into a database that already exists, clearly you need to match the schemas, right? That was something else that threw me off initially. I didn't fully grasp how to do that. I was trying to do it way too soon. You don't need to worry about it early on, okay? The other thing, pro tip, if you switch from manual back to automatic, you just screwed yourself because you just lost all the definitions. You just took hours, not hours, minutes perhaps to define. So don't do that. I know from experience, clearly. All right, so quickly, 5 or so minutes, Eric? Okay. So we've got a few things I just want to show you here real quick. So just examples of some things that I've been using this for. Now, I don't expect you to read this. That's not the intent. This, for me, is a moderately complex workspace to do some data manipulations. I guess the thing I want you to walk away with is, I think if I counted correctly, there's something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe I missed one, readers. You can have as many readers to do what you need to do as you want. I think there's, how many was there? Like 16, data processing steps, functions that were happening across all the different outputs here. And there's really only, in my case, one output, but you can have as many outputs as you need. So, and I'm sure there's lots of people out there that are doing stuff way more complex than this. But it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. And this is an example, a real-world example of some of the stuff that I've been working on. I do a lot of string processing, pulling bits and pieces from strings, creating new strings and things like that, forcing attributes to be like, okay, I know this is EPSG 3071 for all this data, things like that. So again, it can get pretty complicated. I tend to do a lot via code. So I use that attribute manager quite a bit, but you can also use, there's other ways to do things more graphically, I guess, suffice it to say. What was I going to say here? Something really important. You can stack all this stuff together in a way that you can start to have, inputs from one process go to inputs to another, outputs from one process, inputs to another process. Things can get pretty complicated. You can group things together with bookmarks, they're called, which is great for kind of keeping things a little bit sane in your head. Pro tip, there's ways to provide annotation. I think I've got an example, a couple here. Read from EWDC spreadsheet. Get spreadsheet ready to do something, something, something. 3 months from now, heck, 3 days from now, I'm not going to remember what that thing does. So I put a lot of effort, as best I can, into doing that. Python. So this was a thing I didn't realize there was. So you can actually have a Python caller, which is kind of cool. And it doesn't matter what the code actually says, but I have a need to basically go out and calculate the size of a file on disk, pull that in, and put it into the attribute table. So you can call Python scripts. I don't know, I think that's kind of cool, kind of useful, depending on what you've got going on. Extracting photos from an archive on disk. So, for example, given a index of photos, you have a particular area of interest, you want to basically pull out, in my case, all the photos in that area. You can do basic spatial operations, a clipper. We're going to intersect those two things, spit out a list, and automatically copy those to a location on a server and push those same files to an FTP server. So things that are, yeah, it's spatial, of course, but it's not just manipulating the data, it's actually moving stuff around, which is really cool. I saw one transformer, it can tweet something out I swear I'm not making that up. Like you can have a thing that tweets something as part of your, whatever, you know, that's cool. To each their own, I don't know why, but hey, I'm sure there's a use case. So I'm gonna, I think, end here with a couple of quick pro tips based on experience. You can take it or leave it, I suppose, right? I always have an intermediate database. When I'm doing all these manipulations, I put the stuff there, check it before I put it into the final production database, whatever that might be. And I highly recommend that would be a good practice to follow, because there are mistakes. And once it's in your final production database, crap if something goes wrong, which leads to recommendation number 2. It's going to be different for everyone, but I always have some kind of a field that says, okay, here's the things that I just added. So if I do screw up, I can go into the production database and say, select all the things I just added, delete. So have a way, I think I said exit strategy, that's really important. So pro tip, take it or leave it. Last 2 things, I think I'm done, Eric. Well, I already mentioned the auto and manual thing. I burned myself clearly multiple times on that, so learn from my experience, and the annotation. That's also really important. So there's a lot you can do with this tool, a lot that I don't know about. We have like 2 minutes if there's any questions.
Yep, 2 minutes. Are there any questions for Jim?
It can't be all that clear.
Having not used either of these, did you consider using Model Builder for these processes, or?
I didn't, because you know, I have to admit I always struggle with Model Builder, and I knew that this was a tool that could do what it needed to. I perceive this can do a lot more than Model Builder when it comes to these sorts of manipulations, but that's a reasonable question. If you've got relatively simple use cases, start there, because it's already part of desktop. But I did not specifically attempt to do all this in Model Builder. Personal bias. Oh, come on, you guys, it can't be that clear.
I have one for you then.
Uh-oh.
Can you do spatial functions as well? So if you're importing a set of points, could you like populate it with maybe the census tract that that point is within?
Yep. Yes, you can do overlays. In fact, that's exactly what we did for like assigning a county name to a particular point. Is it in this county? Which county is it in? It's a basic spatial joint. So absolutely, you know, the intersections. So the boundaries get fuzzy between this tool and Esri. You could go out and buy this tool separately. I don't have any idea what it costs. I don't know how it would be different. But yeah, there is overlap in that sense. So great question, Eric. Oh, one more.
Should have stayed over here.
So I'm going to get the terms wrong, but how is this different from Esri offers, you know, data loading, where you can make the schema like this attribute becomes this? What functionality does this offer that doesn't?
Well, I mean, that's relatively, I think I'm familiar with the tool you're referring to, or the process you're referring to. I have not done that as I'm understanding it. This is way more complex. You can do a lot more than just changing field names, put this data from this field into this thing over here. This, you probably don't get really, I can understand the question because you're looking at this like, well, I could do that using that process. I like barely scratched what this can do. But you have to evaluate for yourself. Okay, do I already have the tools I need? Great. Or is this really needed for what I need to do? For what I needed to do, this was the right approach. That's all I can, only way I can state it.
I think we're at time. Thank you very much,
All right.
Jim.
Thanks, folks.